birthday today. But also because they have a invited speaker here, a good friend of mine, Jeremy K. Rugenstein. He's coming from, as you can see here, the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg. And then how do you say that again? I told you.
The Zenckenberg Institute.
The Zenckenberg Institute. He's currently a Humboldt Fellow in Germany. Prior to that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at ETH Zurich, which is where him and I had met, and we shared an office for over a year. Prior to that, he was a PhD student at Stanford. That's actually when I first had met him, because he was visiting ETH from time to time to work in the research group that I was in. While at Stanford, he worked on Cenozoic paleoclimate with Paige Chamberlain. He was an NSF graduate student fellow while at Stanford, and a Stanford fellow as well.
Yeah.
And then prior to that, he was a bachelor's student studying earth science at Rice University, and he grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so he knows this part of the world pretty well. Is there anything else you want to advertise about yourself?
Well, I'm excited to be here.
All right.
I love Colorado. The first summer after college, I hiked the Colorado Trail from Denver to Durango, and Colorado is a spectacular place with some incredible geology. So it was one of the best summers. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. What I want to talk to you about today is work I'm still actually doing in Asia using stable isotopes as preserved in paleosols, so buried soils, to track the interaction of climate and tectonics. And I want to motivate this talk with a pretty straightforward question, at least, which is, how do mountains change climate? And there's a lot of reasons why I think this question is interesting. For one, there's potential feedbacks to our surface processes and to tectonics, so mountains change the distribution of precipitation on their surface, and this rearranges a lot of Earth's surface processes. Mountains are also sources of biodiversity. They may also be sources of speciation by blocking migrations or creating more habitat, different types of habitat. And then also, I think climatically, if we can understand how mountains change climate, we can use this as a way of testing our understanding of how general circulation works. And I'm particularly interested in this question from a sort of Earth history perspective. So the period of Earth history that I'm particularly interested in is the Cenozoic. This is a plot of the benthic marine oxygen isotope record over the Cenozoic. So on the x-axis, we have age, back to 65 million years. On the y-axis, it's inverted, is delta 18O of benthic foraminifers. And the way to read this plot is early in the Cenozoic, or the Eocene, the late Paleocene, you had lower delta 18O values, so higher on this graph. It means a warmer Earth, less to no permanent ice on the planet. And over the past 50 million years, the Earth's surface has cooled. This is thought to be maybe 12 to 15 degrees of globally average surface temperature. And today we live in a world with bipolar glaciation, relatively cold. And this tracks relatively well what we think atmospheric CO2 has done. This is a compilation of proxy estimates of atmospheric CO2. So in periods in the past where it's been warm, very little ice on the planet, CO2 is higher, maybe between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million. And sometime over the past 50 million years, CO2 has declined to its sort of pre-industrial value of between 200 and 300 parts per million. And there's an enormous amount of debate about when this decline occurred, what was the absolute magnitude, but the overall picture is clear. High CO2, warm climate with very little permanent ice. And there's a lot of aspects of this record that have been attributed to uplift in mountain ranges. So for example, the rise of grassland ecosystems and the rise of seafloor plants. In many places, this has been attributed to mountain uplift. The establishment of the large deserts in Asia, like the Taklamakan, the Gobi, the Ordos, have all been linked to uplift of various mountain ranges. I think a very cool one is that right here at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, which is when the Antarctic ice sheet formed, you have a major extinction of Eurasian mammals, but not North American mammals. And one hypothesis for this is that there were high mountains in North America, so there were already mammals adapted to living in colder climates in North America than they were in Eurasia. And of course, this entire record, actually, the cooling over the past 50 million years and the reduction in CO2 has been linked to uplift of mountain ranges. So there are a lot of different mechanisms that mountains change climate. There's sort of the chemical method. I worked on this a lot. This is a very hot topic, that essentially mountain uplift supplies fresh rock. This increases the weathering of silicate rocks, and that removes atmospheric CO2. So mountains have this big control on the amount of atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere. There's also physical mechanisms that mountains can change climate. They reorganize local precipitation, causing more graphic precipitation or rain shadows. They change the radiative balance of the Earth's surface. They can divert storm tracks and hold jet streams globally. And they're thought to be important in driving monsoon circulation. And then, because I'm a Humboldt fellow, I should put up Humboldt's famous Naturgemälde, which showed that mountains have this major impact on biology as well. And I put this in, it's a little more speculative, but I think if mountains really do drive speciation or extinctions, they modify the plants and animals on the surface, and that can have feedbacks to change climate and ecosystems on very long time scales. So now a lot of these things you can test. You can sort of test the influence of mountains with general circulation models by removing the mountain and just seeing what happens. You can even test some of these ideas with sort of newer or system models. But again, these are just models. And I think one of the ways we can test whether the models or whether our knowledge is correct is by collecting data. And that's what I do. I'm a geologist, and I primarily collect data from sedimentary sections as a way of understanding how mountains change climate. This is just an example of a really spectacular sedimentary section in eastern Kazakhstan. These are primarily here lake sediments, but it goes into paleosols, my interest further up section. And I'm going to use Asia as a sort of test case to understand how tectonics modifies climate. And I like working in Asia a lot. This is a map of average annual precipitation in Asia. And you can just see from looking at this map that there's a clear influence of tectonics on climate. So here you have this big peak in rainfall. This is due to the Indian monsoon system and orographic forcing of precipitation along the windward side of the Himalayas. You have these very dry areas in the interior of all the mountain ranges in Asia. You even have a relatively large rain shadow across the Altai, so you have far order of magnitude more precipitation on the windward side of the Altai here than you do on the lee side. And I like Asia because there's some obvious connections between tectonics and climate today. And it's thought over the past 65 million years, the tectonics in this area has been dramatically reorganized. So large portions of the Tibetan Plateau may have uplifted during this time period. Certainly the Pamir and the Tian Shan and the Altai are much younger. And so there's been consequently big tectonic changes coincident with large climatic changes in Asia. As you can understand, or try and use this as a test case for understanding the role of tectonics in climate. And the sort of consensus view of how tectonics in Asia modifies climate has really been driven by climate modeling experiments. This is from a paper that's almost 20 years old now, where they took a general circulation model, and this was their sort of modern topography, so all of Asia, and they progressively lowered the topography. So you go from the full mountains to a sort of smaller mountain range to just a plateau to just a ridge, and then no topography at all. And what they found is you get pretty large changes in precipitation across this whole region. So for example, as you go from a low plateau or no plateau to a high plateau, sort of all of this topography, you decrease, you about halve the precipitation in Central Asia. You increase precipitation in this part of the world, sort of East Asian monsoon region. And you actually get this sort of nonlinear effect in the South Asian monsoon region. And this has all been attributed to uplift of the plateau. So it's thought that that uplift of these mountain ranges all across Asia have a major impact in reorganizing climate in Asia. So the tool I'm going to use to sort of address or question this hypothesis are paleosols, so buried soils. This is an outcrop scale view of some paleosols in the Gobi Desert that are late Cretaceous. These are cool. They're so full of dinosaur bones, actually, that most of the float is dinosaur bones. this is a zoom up of a paleosalt. This is actually from the Ogallala Formation in northwest New Mexico. This is the cap rock. So this is a really bizarre sort of so-called stage 6 caliche. This is a paleosalt that's preserved under the cap rock. And you can see some really spectacular structures here. I mean, you have root casts where there were roots. This is full of little carbonate nodules and lots of interstitial carbonate. And I like paleosalts because these are, all this material is calcium carbonate. And the oxygen isotopes in calcium carbonate tell you something about past precipitation. And the carbon isotopes tell you something about past vegetation. So from just one sample, you get this complementary look at hydroclimate in the past. So the rest of the talk, I'll talk about some background of how to think about oxygen isotopes. Then I'm going to sort of reconstruct atmospheric circulation in Asia over the past 65 million years. Then we'll talk about some very interesting modifications of climate by these smaller mountain ranges to the north, the Tian Shan and the Altai. Well, I say that they're smaller than the Tibetan Plateau, but they're still massive mountain ranges. And then I'll talk about some future things that I'd like to do building on this work. So let's start with oxygen isotopes. Imagine you have an ocean and maybe a plateau, a mountain range next to that ocean. And in oxygen isotope world, we use delta notation. That just means we take the 18O to 16O ratio of the sample and normalize it to the standard. And in this case, I think all my plots are normalized to ocean water, which is defined as 0 per mil in oxygen isotope space. So if you evaporate some water from the ocean, you preferentially put the lighter isotope in the vapor. So this has a value of negative 13 per mil. This means that there's less 18O in the vapor than there is in the ocean. And then you advect that vapor onto land, and you rain out some amount of that moisture. So you put the heavier isotope back in the liquid phase, so this has a higher value than the vapor, and that returns to the ocean by a runoff. And so as you go up and over this mountain range, you get progressively lower and lower values of your precipitation and your vapor as you rain out your oxygen isotopes. So this is traditionally modeled as a Rayleigh distillation process from the start of your storm track to the theoretical end of the storm track. This is oxygen isotopes here. You get lower and lower values of oxygen isotopes. And this is actually the basis for so-called stable isotope paleoaltimetry. That you can take a value at this peak, that calculate how much rain out it's been, and you make some assumption then about the height of the mountain range. But this misses at least one major part of the hydrological cycle, and that is the role of the land surface. The land surface, of course, returns an enormous amount of vapor to the atmosphere through transpiration or through evaporation off of least surfaces or bare ground. And the only thing you need to know for this talk, at least, is that there is isotopic fractionation during evaporation, but there is none to very little during transpiration. So if you think about this graphically, this would be thinking about it in sort of a reactive transport sense. If you go from the start of your storm track to the end of your storm track, and this is delta 18O precipitation, if none of your vapor is returned to the atmosphere, then you'll get progressively lower and lower values as you remove all the water from that course. If just 50% of your moisture is returned, and it depends a little bit on whether this is evaporation or transpiration, you'll shallow this gradient. And of course, if you return all of your water to the atmosphere, none of it goes to runoff, then you'll have no change in the oxygen isotopes of your precipitation along this hypothetical storm track. So this is a nice kind of conceptual framework because it allows you to put some changes that we might observe in the geologic record in context. If you have a sedimentary section, for example, this is one I'll return to at the end of the talk. Here we have values that average around 21 per mil, and then there's this 4 per mil negative shift. And just in that conceptual framework, you would say, well, we move from an environment where we have more recycling of vapor to more partitioning of moisture into runoff. So we move down on that graph. Equivalently, if you have spatial data, you can sort of use it to track moisture circulation. So this is a map of river water delta 18O in North America. Red values are low, blue values are high. And you can see largely the main pathways by which moisture enters the continental US in this graph. You have moisture that's delivered by the Great Plains low-level jet that's propagated northward. You have moisture that enters North America from the North American monsoon and rains out here along the Mud-Beyond Rim. There's Pacific moisture that goes from the west into the Rocky Mountain interior, and it rains out here along the Cascades and the Sierras. So you get very sharp gradients in oxygen isotopes as you remove your heavier isotope during rain.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
If you go to the Pacific coast, why isn't that near zero? Shouldn't that be right at sea level, sort of?
It has to, yeah, so it depends a little bit on the precise fractionation between the evaporation of the vapor from the ocean water and then the return to the land surface. And so it's not all quantitatively sort of returned back as 0 per mil liquid to land. So you do get some effect related to wind speeds and amount of entrainment of moisture that changes the exact fractionation into the vapor, which is why you're not quite at 0 in most places along the coast. So let's return to Asia. This again is the map of average annual precipitation in Asia. And for oxygen isotopes, at least, what we're interested in is how the moisture has reached its destination in this map. So to look at that, I'm going to show you atmospheric circulation in Asia as shown by a back trajectory model called high split. I'm going to show you over 3,000 model trajectories just for summertime and just precipitation producing trajectories. And this will become clear in a minute what's going on. So this is again a map of Asia, and here I've started air parcels at Lhasa and seen from where they come from. So most precipitating air parcels at Lhasa start in the Bay of Bengal or the Himalayan foreland, and they propagate northward and up and over the Himalayas. And this is this is due to the South Asian monsoon. So all the moisture is coming from the south. If I move further north on the plateau, we again have this southerly route for moisture that reaches this point here. But we now have almost equivalent amount of moisture that actually comes from the north and the west. If I move further north into the Chaidon Basin, now there's no southerly moisture. All the moisture is coming from the west over the Jungar Gate and over the Tarim Basin to this eastern point in the Chaidon Basin. And of course, if we go even further north into Mongolia, again, there's no southerly moisture. It's all coming from the west over Kazakhstan and splitting around the Altai Mountains here. And so not only is this moisture coming from the west, but it's actually been highly recycled. So this is a map of continental precipitation recycling ratios. And the way to read this map is a value of 0, blue value, means all the moisture originated in the ocean. And a value of red means that all the moisture originated from the land surface. And you can see there's just a bullseye around eastern Eurasia, and this is because moisture started in the North Atlantic, precipitated over western Eurasia, then got transpired or evaporated, and reprecipitated over eastern Eurasia. And this sort of really broad picture of circulation is really well reflected in oxygen isotopes today. So you have low oxygen isotopes in southern Tibet due to distillation of this moisture over the Himalayas. You have high delta 18O delivered by the westerlies. This is very recycled moisture coming from Eurasia across this really broad region. And then actually what's really cool is in the central part of the plateau, you have these intermediate values. And this reflects the mixing of very high delta 18O moisture from the west and low delta 18 moisture from the south. You can see this again really well if I plot this against latitude. So this is latitude against delta 18O. And you get this strong depletion as you go towards the Himalayan crest. Then you get higher values as you mix with westerly moisture. And then you get lower and lower values toward the poles. That has to do with rain out and moisture transport toward the poles. So we can now use the same graph to think about expectations for sedimentary data. Well, if there was never any topography, at one point in the past there was no topography, say no Himalayas or no plateau, then we shouldn't expect this negative value. We should just get something that resembles the latitudinally average oxygen isotope gradient. Alternatively, say we had a high plateau or a high Himalayas for a long time, we should get this depletion, but maybe there was some point where the Tian Shan and the Altai really blocked all the moisture from the west, and you only had monsoonal moisture, then we wouldn't get these high values again. So these are just some predictions to keep in the back of your mind as we look at the data. So what I'm going to do next is essentially recreate this map over the last 65 million years, more like 50 million years. And I'm going to take advantage of the fact that in Asia, we have an enormous database of samples. All these gray points, when I started my PhD, this is where we had Cenozoic isotope data. So it focused primarily on the plateau. And if you want to compare actually with climate model predictions, remember they're including many parts of Asia north of the plateau, so sort of the Mongolian plateau up here, in their climate model predictions. So what I spent most of my PhD doing, and I've still worked on, is collecting data from further north of the plateau in ranges, in sort of basins influenced by the Hungai and the Altai Mountains. And I'll just zoom in on this. This is an interesting place because it's not necessarily true that this area has had the same tectonic history as the Tibetan Plateau. And you can see this actually, I think, even nicely just from sort of schematic sedimentary sections in this part of the world. In Western Mongolia, you have really thick lower Cretaceous sandy channel sediments. And there's a massive unconformity where there's essentially no deposits of late Cretaceous or Paleogene age. And instead you switch on deposition again in the Neogene. So there was some basin inversion event between lower Cretaceous and the Neogene. It's similar in eastern Mongolia. You have these big lower Cretaceous, primarily lake basin sediments that are very, very organic rich. Then you also have lots of late Cretaceous sediments. This is where all these famous dinosaur fossils are. And then there's a major unconformity, and you again get deposition starting in the late Paleogene or the Neogene. And I put here, there's a few basalts. The chronologies in Mongolia are difficult to establish. But I think my just gut interpretation from just these two very schematic sections is that there was probably high topography here back in the Paleogene. And that's why you don't get deposition. And there's since been these basin formation due to small-scale rifting that has preserved small amounts of Neogene sediments in these basins. And these sections are really spectacular. This is one from far western Mongolia, where you start to get the Oligocene, but then the Miocene and Pliocene Quaternary. This is another section. It's almost 200 meters. These aren't high sedimentation rates by any means, but you do have really spectacular outcrops that are easy to access in this part of the world. And then this is the one section where we have really good age constraints because we have paleomag that puts us right at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, and then basalts here. And so a lot of the stratigraphy in Mongolia is actually correlated to precisely this section because it's the one place where we have a really firm geochronometer. So just keep that in mind as I show these big correlations, that the temporal controls are not fantastic. So let's look at all the data then from Asia. This is now the delta 18O of the calcium carbonate, and this is age on this axis. I'm going to only put up the Central Asia data. There's a fair amount of scatter in this data, but by and large it's between about 19 per mil and 23 per mil. And if I put up all the data from Tibet, it almost always plots to lower values than the data from Central Asia. So we can look at this spatially. If I assume that there hasn't been any shortening in Asia, so this is just on modern topography, if we look at Eocene data, you have low values in the lee of the Himalaya, high values in Central Asia. If we look at Oligocene data, it's the same story. The one low value we have in the lee of the Himalayas, intermediate values in the plateau, and high values in Central Asia. Again, in the Miocene, it's the same picture, low delta 18O in the lee of the Himalayas, high in Central Asia, and this intermediate point in the Central Plateau, and the same thing in the Pliocene and Quaternary. You can plot this again another way, and that's against latitude, where I think this is especially clear. So this is latitude against reconstructed precipitation value, and this is actually modern precipitation, just for guidance. If I plot Eocene data, it plots exactly on top of where you think it would plot if you just had modern data to make predictions. And that's true in the Eocene, it's true in the Oligocene, it's true in the Miocene, and it's true in the Pliocene Quaternary. And I'm bidding large time periods here, but there's very little change in both the spatial structure of this data and the absolute values through time. And I think this invariance suggests that on long time scales, over broad regions, large-scale atmospheric circulation in Asia has remained relatively unchanged through time. And what I specifically mean by that is that you've always had moisture in the southern part of the plateau that's been distilled over some high topography, probably a ridge like the Gangdesi Arc. And presumably that's some sort of monsoonally driven circulation. You've always had westerly derived moisture in central Asia. And when you do have values in the central plateau, it always seems to suggest that the northern extent of monsoonal moisture has always been in the central part of the plateau. And so the boundaries between monsoonal circulation and westerly circulation have not changed dramatically in Asia through time. So we can think back to these sort of naive hypotheses. You know, we've always had westerly moisture here. We've never seen any latitudinal profile that looks like this. And similarly, we've always had some sort of topography near the southern part of Tibet today that's allowed distillation of moisture. And so, to summarize sort of this part of the talk, in general, despite really large changes in tectonics and large changes in global climate, the boundaries between westerly circulation and monsoonal circulation have been more or less constant. You've always had monsoons in the south, westerlies in the north, and that if you've had further plateau uplift in the Cenozoic or further uplift of the Tian Shan or the Altai, it seems, at least on this picture, to have had a minor influence. And I think this supports actually a lot of data, and particularly modeling work, for example, that shows that circulation in Asia, this is by Jared Rowe, is relatively insensitive to big tectonic shifts. And I think it supports sort of at this point, a relatively new idea of monsoonal circulation in Asia that says you don't need a big plateau to drive monsoonal circulation. All you need is a high ridge to block north-south air exchange and keep warm subtropical air warm enough to drive monsoonal circulation. Now, there's some caveats to this. Independent timing of tectonics in Asia remains very problematic. So a lot of the information about the height of the plateau has actually come from stable isotope paleoaltimetry. And I think that's problematic because you're not seeing paleoaltimetry signals, you're seeing this atmospheric circulation signal. Also, there could have been major changes in the intensity of precipitation or the amount of precipitation, and this is hard to get at from just this sort of analysis of oxygen isotopes. It might be possible if you combine this with carbon isotopes or maybe even with some inverse modeling of oxygen isotopes. But regardless, I think the sort of spatial extent of circulation has been more or less constant. So that's maybe a little, I find that a little depressing because, of course, as geologists, we'd like to think that mountains matter in the Earth system. And so I'm going to give you an example where I think they really do matter in Asia. And what I was interested in is if this has all been westerly moisture, derived sort of moisture, can we sort of track this upstream and see how the balance between transpiration and evaporation in Western Eurasia has impacted downwind moisture? And so I thought, well, we should go windward of these basins to try and do this. And I was also fairly astonished that these mountain ranges have no effect because they're smaller than the plateau, but there's a major rain shadow across the Altai, for example. So all the data I've shown you, especially in this part of the world, is more or less leeward of all the big mountain ranges. So we wanted to go to a site that we thought might be windward of these ranges to test sort of what the incoming moisture flux might look like. And this is the Zaysan Basin in eastern Kazakhstan. It's a remarkable basin. This is a geologic map, a Soviet geological map that we used to find some of our sections. There's a lake today in the basin, and there are lake sediments all the way back to late Cretaceous. I think this is likely the oldest lake on planet Earth. It's certainly older than Lake Baikal. And here on the southern part of the basin, you have really spectacular growth strata that have been incised by small streams, and so you have great outcrops of essentially late Cretaceous to modern sediments. So I'll just show you, so when I went there, this is the record I thought we would be looking at. These gray lines are all the data from leeward basins, and I thought we would see something that just looks like this. There's been no influence of the Tian Shan at the Altai, and so the data from this windward basin looks identical. This is our Neogene sedimentary section. It's about 200 meters. It's pinned by this really well-constrained fossils locality at the very top. This is the carbon data. I haven't had a chance to talk about the carbon data, but this generally increases by 2 to 3 per mil, which indicates more or less a drying over this period. But the oxygen isotopes are really interesting because they have this negative 4 per mil shift between these two formations. And so to put this in context with the rest of the sections in Central Asia, I'm going to rely on this mammalian biochron and some paleomag, which would be great to redo. And then bin this data by formation and assume constant sedimentation. So some big assumptions, but I think no matter what assumptions you make, you find that this record looks dramatically different than the rest of the data in Central Asia. Whereas all the rest of the data in general increases or is constant, there's this dramatic 4 per mil negative shift sometime in the late Miocene. And so you need to think of some way to explain this data. You need to think of some way to decouple the windward oxygen isotope records from the leeward oxygen isotope records. And to explain what I think is going on here, we're going to switch to modern climate. So again, this is a map of average annual precipitation in Asia. And if you look, I mean, there is this rain shadow across the Altai, but there's not a huge amount of difference if you look across Kazakhstan, Central Asia, in rainfall. But that changes if you look at the seasonality of precipitation. So this is so in red is areas of Asia that dominantly receive moisture in the summer, and in blue areas that receive moisture dominantly in the spring and the fall. And the Tian Shan and the Altai mark this very dramatic barrier, sort of boundary between a spring and fall dominated precipitation regime and a summertime regime. And this is driven, I think, by the migration of the mid-latitude jet every year. So this is a map of counts of the jet in January. So the colors are counts of the jet at every point in space. And these bars are the interannual averages. And you can see in January, for the most part, the mid-latitude jet is concentrated south of the plateau. As you move into the spring, in March, it's still south of the plateau, but there are more appearances of the jet to the north of the plateau. By May, the jet is sort of diffusely defined across the plateau with large variability. And by July, it's firmly north of the plateau, and it never makes an appearance south of the plateau. And in the spring, in the fall, it sort of reverses this migration. And it's during this migration, particularly in the spring, as you get cyclones that are routed along the jet, they interact with the high topography of the Tian Shan and the Altai, and they produce orographic precipitation. So this is why you get a spring and fall dominated precipitation regime in windward of the Tian Shan and the Altai. And this has major impacts on oxygen isotopes. So there's no long-term monitoring stations in Kazakhstan, or especially in eastern Kazakhstan. So I've had to rely on oxygen isotope estimates of precipitation from climate models. So this is months of the year, and this is delta 18O of precipitation. And it doesn't matter what climate model you use, you see a really large annual shift in oxygen isotopes with the year, about on the order of 15 to 20 per mil. There is one monitoring station in Urumqi. I mean, it's so far away, but it's the closest one, and it shows the same pattern. And what I think is going on is that in the leeward basins, like these would be the Chaidon Basin, the Tarim Basin, the Jamgar Basin, your moisture is occurring in the summer. So it's at the end of that rainy season that you're forming carbonates as the plants die down, but you've weathered enough material to form carbonate in solution. And so those carbonates are forming at the end of the summer season, and they're locking in this really high value. But carbonates to the windward part of the Tian Shan, they're forming in the shoulder season, and so they're locking in a somewhat lower oxygen isotope value. And so what I want to suggest is that maybe in the early Miocene, soil carbonates in Kazakhstan were recording a summertime precipitation regime. So they were locking in this very high value. And then at some point in the late Miocene, you had uplift of the Tian Shan or the Altai, at least uplift enough that it can interact substantially with the mid-latitude jet. Maybe there's also a component of global cooling, so a sort of southward shift in the mean position of the jet during the spring. So you increase the interaction of jet with topography, and that shifts your carbonate formation to the shoulder seasons, and that's what drives this negative shift. And So I want to come back to this graph because there are actually two other records that decrease in the Neogene. So this record is not the only one. That's the most dramatic. That's a record from Issyk-Kul and a record from the Jungar Basin. And those basins are here. They're not strictly windward basins. I mean, Issyk-Kul is sort of intermontane basins, but they're more on the windward side of this whole area. And so I suspect they're also recording this effect. And the reason why they might start earlier than, say, the record in Zyson is up here. Possibly this represents the northward propagation of deformation as India is colliding with Asia. So your deformation front is sort of shifting northward as you progress in the Neogene. There's also, if you look at the lee part of the Altai, so this is Zyson Basin here. We have data from this part of the Gobi Desert in the lee of the Altai, so there's a big rain shadow here. The oxygen isotopes are complicated in this spot, but the carbon is pretty clear. Both these sites, there's a really dramatic increase in your delta 13C of carbonates. Again, the age constraints aren't great, so it occurs sometime in the late Miocene. But this means that there was a substantial drying in this part of the world. So this is well far north of C4 vegetation, so this is not a C4 vegetation effect. And I think this indicates sometime in here, you had uplift of the Altai, and you dried out substantially this part of Western Mongolia. And finally, and this is the really speculative part of the talk, so this is a record of Aeolian dust accumulation in the North Pacific. There's this dramatic increase in the late Pliocene, and this is driven probably by northern hemisphere glaciation. But there's been this in-bank peak of about 8 million years. And what I want to suggest is that this is linked with Altai uplift. And the way it's linked is the Altai today is one of the largest sources of lee cyclones in Central Asia. And it's these lee cyclones in the spring, primarily, which are strong enough to loft dust and create the big dust storms in Asia and carries dust all the way around the northern hemisphere. And so, I think sometime in the late Miocene, the Altai became high enough to interact with the jet that creates, that increases lee cyclogenesis, and that creates more dustiness in the northern hemisphere. And sure enough, there is a big shift in the character of Loess deposition on the Loess Plateau right at about 8 million years. So, to summarize, I think in general, large-scale atmospheric circulation, by that I mean the boundaries between monsoonal circulation and westerly circulation, are relatively insensitive to climatic and tectonic changes. And what that means actually is that it's really difficult to detect plateau uplift in paleo records, especially if you're looking at the central or northern plateau, because you're just overwhelmed by this sort of large-scale circulation effect. But with that said, there is this big shift, I think, in the late Miocene, as recorded in the seasonality of precipitation, that's forced by uplift of the Tian Shan and or Altai. And this has potentially major downwind Aeolian impacts. So before I finish, in just the few minutes I have left, I just wanted to give you a sort of overview of a few ideas that I would like to carry on with. And ultimately, things like this, I think we can start to use sedimentary data as a way of quantitatively constraining the Earth system response to perturbations. I'm particularly interested in carbon cycle perturbations. We're, of course, living in a massive carbon cycle perturbation now. And sort of driven by questions like, will the world get wetter or drier? And in what regions will get wetter or drier? How do ecosystems shift in response to warming? How, in fact, even does the carbon cycle itself respond to a carbon cycle perturbation? And then, finally, how do changes in the climate across the carbon cycle perturbation affect erosion and nutrient supply and large-scale biogeochemistry? And the approach that I hope to use is start with collecting data from sedimentary basins. I mean, this is the record we have of the geologic past in higher CO2 periods, but also across big perturbations. Developing models that can be inverted of the sedimentary data. And then testing this data against climate model predictions of greenhouse climates. So as an example of this, I alluded to this a bit in the talk. I think it might be possible to use Eurasia as a testing ground to understand how large-scale moisture dynamics change, so continental scale moisture dynamics change in a warmer world. This again is modern precipitation isotopes. You have high delta 18O in Western Eurasia, relatively low in Eastern Eurasia. This is actually all data that's overprinted by the East Asian monsoon. And what I've shown you today, what the whole talk was essentially about, was the sink of moisture. I mean, this is the last place where this moisture lands before it gets shunted back into the ocean, either through evaporation or through runoff. But this gradient across the whole continent reflects the degree of evapotranspiration versus runoff that you have at different stages as moisture gets transported east. So it might be possible, if you had enough data going back in time during periods of high CO2, that you might be able to answer questions about how does the transportive fraction of moisture increase in a warmer world, how does runoff change in a warmer world, and Eurasia at least gives you the scale and sort of the fetch to do this on a really large scale. Maybe more locally, I think you can do this actually in really just outside the door here. This in shaded and points are river water oxygen isotopes. And Fort Collins sits just at the edge of one of the largest oxygen isotope gradients in the world. So you have values of about -2 per mil in Texas and -16 per mil in the Front Range. And this has to do with moisture transport as the Great Plains low-level jet delivers moisture and that rains out. Some of it's recycled, of course, as moisture is transported northward. Some of it has to do with mixing of westerly moisture, westerly wintertime moisture with summertime moisture. And in fact, the strength of the jet itself is partly controlled by the height of the Rocky Mountains. So it might be possible then to make spatial data sets in this part of the world to constrain how these sorts of dynamics change in the past and how they were influenced by tectonics in the past. And I put here, this black is an outline of the Ogallala Formation. So this big kind of gravel sheet that was deposited on the high plains. And the Ogallala Formation is spectacular because it's just full of calcic paleosols. So you have an opportunity to collect really extensive spatial data sets. Again, the age constraints aren't fantastic, but I think there might be some ways around that. And finally, this is a map in shading, and this is evapotranspiration over runoff in background. And these points, I haven't updated Asia unfortunately, are all the places where we have oxygen isotope data. And the point of this graph is primarily to show with especially carbonate data, you're limited to areas that are semi-arid. So you're limited to areas effectively where precipitation is less than potential evapotranspiration. I mean, you're forming essentially evaporites in the soil. So we have very little knowledge of how the hydrological cycle changes in the past in areas outside the mid-latitudes. So in the boreal realm and also in the tropics. And so, one thing that we need to start thinking about is getting more paleo data from non-carbonate bearing mid-latitude sediments. And this includes looking at things like authigenic clays, where you can also extract oxygen isotope data. You can do compound-specific work with organic matter, and also starting to use sediment geochemistry as a quantitative tool to back out climate. So with that, I'll just put up a summary of some future work and happy to take any questions.
Plenty of time for questions if people are ready.
Just before I ask anything else, you had delta 18 of carbonates on some side, and then other ones delta 18 of, calling it delta 18 of water. How did you relate?
Yeah, so for that yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good, here we go. Yeah, so here, in this, in these plots, in the colored points I have the water, the modern water value, and then here I've taken the carbonate value and converted into water. And for that I assume a temperature of formation. For this I've used, it actually turns out if you just use 25 degrees Celsius as a sort of just first order estimate of the temperature at which carbonate forms, this is the numbers you get. They they resemble the modern. If you use, for example, let's say the modern temperature distribution, so you assume that hasn't changed through time, it doesn't change this picture very much. And the reason is that the fractionation factor only changes by like 0.2 per mil per degree Celsius. So even across a 10-degree change in surface temperature, you're only getting a 2 per mil change in the fractionation factor. So I think it's relatively insensitive. I mean, one way you could get around this though is doing clumped isotope work. So you're actually measuring directly the temperature of mineral formation.
In your future work, you suggested you might look at some geochemistry.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, more specific, what you think you might look at.
Yeah. The thing I would really be interested in doing is in particular looking at the chemical index of alteration of sediments, because there's been actually a lot of work in Asia looking at the CIA and trying to deduce what the sort of relative ratio of erosion to weathering is in big sections. And I think, I have other work that suggests that you should see even in the Cenozoic big changes in globally average CIA, but there's just not enough data out there to know, and it's at least a relatively straightforward measurement to make. And it has a problem. There are grain size issues, but it might be possible to try and back out some of these sorts of questions with that. So that's specifically what I was thinking about with cellular geochemistry. Yeah.
Can you take global atmospheric models and predict oxygen isotopes?
Yeah. I don't know how many models there are now. At least half a dozen models that have oxygen isotopes built in to the model. So the model actually tracks 18 oxygen and 16 oxygen in the fractionation that occurs during evaporation and during eddy transport and ejection. So there are a lot of GCMs now that do this, and in fact, people are starting to do this in deep time. Take oxygen isotope-enabled GCMs, modify the paleogeography and the topography, and then make predictions about actually what carbonate value you should get. So people are just starting to do that now, actually. So CESM just down the road at NCAR has one of the primary models used for making oxygen isotope work in climate models.
Including ice caps as well, right?
Yeah. There's certainly, I don't know if CSM has it in ice. I'm sure they have it in sea ice, but there are also ice sheet models that have oxygen isotopes built in as well, as a way of tracking the composition, the oxygen isotope composition of ice, and like the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets in the warm time.
Yeah, you're referring that late Miocene uplift of the Altai affecting the precipitation patterns. What do geologic constraints say about the timing of that uplift?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It turns out getting the independent evidence for Altai uplift is really difficult. And the reason is there's an enormous amount of apatite fission tract data and uranium, thorium, helium work in the Altai. And it's all old. It is all like 100 million years, 200 million years, reflective of the previous orogeny that closed the Mongol-Okhotsk Sea, and then the subsequent rifting after that. So Thermocon has been of no help in getting the Altai.
But let's place some constraints on how much uplift we're going to
Right, so there hasn't been much exhumation. Exactly, there hasn't been much exhumation. And so most of the sort of independent evidence comes from the fact that there's across much of this part of much of this part of Asia, particularly in here, there's this major unconformity where you only get late Oligocene Neogene sediments, and it's thought to be that there must be some source region for those sediments, and it's probably has to do with Altai uplift. So that's the primary evidence. There's also, there's a fair amount of neotectonic work in the Altai that shows it's a fairly active mountain range. And of course, you might be able to do sort of very, very low temperature thermochronometry like 4.3 helium to get at a, say, very young or very low exhumation rates. But yeah, no, people have looked with thermochron. It's too bad they're it's too bad that all the data are really old. So yeah, Sean.
Is there any cosmogenic data from that area yet?
There is some cosmogenic data from here. I don't know of any data from the Altai, actually. Yeah, I can't think of any cosmogenic data from the Altai. There is some from the cyan ranges up here, but nothing from the Altai that I can think of.
You should collect some bags of sand.
Yeah, it's a good idea. There's plenty of sand. So.
I got two, if that's okay.
Yeah.
One, does sea surface temperature change in latitude and with time? Doesn't that change your starting isotope composition? Instead of assuming ocean is 0,
Yeah.
the fractionation with that factor into your data, I mean, that could change it several per mil.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, I just go to the beginning here. But there will be some, I think, small effect of sea surface temperature. I think in most of Central Asia, you're totally that signal is sort of overwhelmed by this continental recycling signature. For example, I mean, from the Eocene to today, the guess is there's been about, this would say that there's been 4 per mil of change in the ocean, but about half of this, more or less, is just temperature change and change in the fractionation factor into calcite. So I think the best guess is there's been maybe 2 to 3 per mil change in the mean ocean water delta 18O. My sort of assumption in all of this work is that 2 to 3 per mil is minor compared with the sort of large variability we see, which is almost 15 or 20 per mil across this area. So I've largely ignored changes in seawater oxygen isotope values. It certainly might matter in a place like here. There's some work from speleothems, I think in the Himalayas here, that show that because you have so much runoff coming off the Himalayas, you create this sort of freshwater lens over the Bay of Bengal that's relatively depleted in oxygen isotopes, and then that water gets recycled back into storms and precipitates here. So you can get really, really low values, sort of unexpectedly low values in speleothems here. I think you don't see that in carbonate data because the carbonates are just averaging over far longer time scans than the speleothems are. So, I would guess 10, maybe in some places 100,000 years. So you're sort of averaging over orbital forcing.
I got a bias question. In some of these areas, I've worked where I've seen stable isotope of 018 probably almost 10 per mil depleted relative to modern precipitation in groundwater. Can groundwater be a repository in some places, maybe of telling you paleo changes, maybe circulation patterns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think, that's a really good point. I mean, I think much of this data is either soil waters or it's shallow groundwater, so it's not recording this very depleted signature. And the other big assumption here that seems to be borne out by, if you look at just modern soil carbonates, is that it's recording the summertime precipitation value. I think in a lot of systems, you might get depletion of groundwater because you're recharging during the winter when you have generally, and especially in the mid-latitudes, lower oxygen isotopes, but that's just not getting preserved in geological proxies, or at least not in these geological proxies. And I think that might explain some of the discrepancy between these very depleted values in groundwater and these sorts of values, which seem to be just dominantly controlled by summertime precipitation. That's my guess, and it would be very interesting to try and find some way of looking at the groundwater value, or what proxy you would use. Yeah.
So I was looking at thinking about your question about how the oxygen isotopes are being modulated in the second part of your talk, and how you brought up that there's a difference between partitioning between transpiration and evaporation as to be recycled across the continent.
Yeah.
And that would be heavily impacted by the type of vegetation.
Right.
In terms of whether or not it's transpiration or evaporation. And so over these long time horizons then, there could be this huge reorganization of terrestrial vegetation in terms of dominant species, and even kind of landscape type.
Yeah.
Land cover type.
Yeah.
And so have you thought about how that might be masking a signal or producing a signal, or is that just going to get washed out over time?
No, so I think the biggest change you see is probably in transition from forest to grasslands. And you don't, I would have guessed you would see it. Let me get to this overview slide. I would guess you would have seen it. I was a little surprised that you don't see much of an impact because there's, I think, fairly decent evidence that this whole area converted to grasslands, or sort of grasslands took over the vegetation something like between 20 and 30 million years ago. And that's roughly coincidence with the rise of grasslands globally. And I would have expected that you would see a big signal because grasslands and forests have very different transpiration capacities, and grasslands especially tend to transpire in the summer much more efficiently. But I think you're just overwhelmed by the fact that here you've already quantitatively recycled everything. So you're not seeing any upwind signal because everything's just getting recycled. So any changes are dwarfed by that, which is why I think if you had data from further west, say in Georgia or Armenia or Azerbaijan, you might be able to pick up something like that. Still, when you're sitting somewhere below this line, and you might be able to catch this sort of spatial transition. That's my guess. There is one interesting thing which has still never been explained. I think it's in this. I have a hard time picking out the record here, but there is in the Himalayan foreland here, there is a big change in oxygen isotopes on the order of 5 or 6 per mil. I mean, this has been known since the 80s. And it was initially thought that this was the onset of the Asian monsoon system, and I think no one really thinks that anymore. But I think that signal actually has to do, it's coincident with a big change in carbon isotopes, which reflect the spread of C4 grasses. And that signal is probably best interpreted as a change in transpiration, upwind transpiration, as grasses took over the Indian subcontinent. That's my guess. And there's a few people working on it, but I think that's where you see that signal quite clearly.
Could you see that in C4, C13, do you think?
Yeah, you see it really well. Actually, what's interesting is the C3, C4 transition. I have it. Yeah. This is it here. This is all the data from the Himalayan foreland. This is all in the Shawalics. There's this incredible shift in the late Miocene. And if I was to put the oxygen isotope data on top of this, it's far more diffuse than this. And it's not quite as big a change, but it's far more diffuse. And that may have to do with the fact that I think oxygen isotopes are a far more regional signal than carbon isotopes, which are far more local, overlying vegetation type signal. But these individual records here, I'm bidding a lot of data, are really abrupt in carbon isotope space.
So I think we'll leave it there. If you've got questions for Jeremy still, come and hound him, please.
Yeah.
He's a pleasurable person to talk to.
We'll give him his email, he's going to get hounded by email.
Yeah. I didn't put it by email, but you get it from Sean or so. No, thanks a bunch.
Yeah.
The girls will want it.
So that's one of these sediments are so big that there's very little organic matter.
I'm gonna go get